I'm Charles with East Texas Historical Fencing, and continuing our series on the basics of rapier, I'll be doing a quick overview of cutting. Now, cutting with the rapier has been a long, controversial topic in regards to can rapiers cut, should rapiers cut, should we allow cutting in tournaments, should we teach cutting at all? But cutting is a part of the art. All of the masters teach it, even the later rapier periods teach it. They do give some caveats, but it does exist in those systems. And some rapier systems, like Destreza, have a lot of cuts, especially in the conclusion, in their grapples. So, we're going to start with the basic understanding of what cutting is and what we're going to call our cuts. Now, I realize in previous videos I talked about how I wasn't going to use a lot of Italian or other languages to describe something, but I find that because a lot of fencing systems take a lot of time to talk about the dominant and non-dominant side, and in English we often say the right and left side, it'll be easier to use the Italian terms mandrito and reverso to refer to the right side and the left side. Since I'm a right-handed fencer, for me a mandrito is a cut from the right and a reverso is a cut from the left. But if you are a left-handed fencer, then your mandrito will be from the left and your reverso will be from the right. So if I use mandrito and reverso, it'll be universal to anybody watching. So to begin, we're going to talk about the different forms of cutting that exist and the different angles that we cut most often in rapier. And we're going to start with our cuts from a mandrito, so my dominant side, my right side, and we start cutting an X across the body. In earlier Italian systems, it's referred to as a fendente, which means from the teeth to the knees. So we think about cutting through the top of the head down to the knee, and then our reverso, the same angle on the other side. And then we have cuts from the bottom, like this, and like this. And then we have cuts in the middle, like this, and like this. In Italian, this is your fendente, this is your satani, and these are your mezzani, like this, cuts in the middle. If you're German, this will be your Oberhaus, or your Zorns, this will be your Unterhaus, these will be your Mittelhaus, like this. Now, there are other cuts in rapier. You can do things like this, twears or swears, however you know them as. You can come around and cut with the false edge like that. These are all specific actions that you can do in very specific situations. But for the purpose of this video, because it is a basics video, we're only going to go over the basics of certain cutting for rapier. Within most cutting systems, there are 3 different types of cuts that we can throw: from the wrist, from the elbow, and from the shoulder. Now, all 3 of those suggest that that is where those cuts are coming from, and while that is true, all 3 involve and must have hip engagement. While I can actually stand completely still and throw the cuts from all 3 of those joints, I still must engage my hips if I want to have any type of power, any type of force behind my cuts. So when I throw my cuts from the wrist, I'm still engaging my hips all the way across to be able to go forward. As you can see, the difference is, though I can spin pretty quickly, there's not a lot of force behind this cut unless I go completely with the hips in that way. So cutting with the hips has more to do with generating force and is necessary, especially with a small bladed weapon like a rapier. A lot of cuts in rapier are done with the tip or with the last third of the blade. Cuts with the strong, especially in tournaments, are highly scrutinized, and though some historical examples do have sharp blades all the way to the length of the blade, many only have sharp blades from the middle to the end, and some even are perfectly square blades until the last third where there is an edge. So take that into account when you're learning how to use the rapier. Furthermore, one of our older masters, Giganti, tells us that because cutting is so difficult, it is necessary that we become good at it. And to become good at it, it is necessary that you do 100 cuts per angle per day, per side. Which sounds like a lot, because it is a lot, but that's him stressing how important it is that you become good at cutting because it is so difficult to pull off. It's easy to perform the action, but if you ever do any test cutting with a sharp rapier, you'll quickly find out that unless your form is pretty good or near perfect, it's difficult to cut through even the easiest targets like fruits and water bottles. So, when learning how to cut, the first thing we're going to talk about is something called casting. I understand that a lot of different people don't teach cutting as a cast. However, at East Texas Historical Fencing, this is our preferred method, so it's what I shall be teaching. Casting is when you send your sword forward and you allow it to pull you forward as though you're casting a fishing rod. We used to explain it with fly fishing, but it turns out no one here in Texas has ever done fly fishing. So we decided to come up with another example, and that example is if you've seen a Marvel film, and when you watch Thor throw his hammer propels him forward and it pulls him off the ground towards his direction. My friend Martin Fabian has talked about when you have your hand on a leash and your dog takes off and you get pulled away by your dog, it should be the same thing. It should be the same feeling that you feel. So when I say hold my sword up in the air and I go to cut, it should project me forward like this. And I should project my tip all the way in front of me into my guard. Now you'll notice my regular fencing guard, as I demonstrated in previous videos, is here, like this. This is not an optimized guard for cutting. In earlier systems like side sword, when you see them stand a little bit more upright and a little bit more squared off, and they stand like this, or something like this, these positions are a lot more optimized for cutting through the angles because that is a mainly cut and thrust weapon. And while the rapier is also a cut and thrust weapon, it's more of a cut and thrust weapon. So within rapier, most of the time when you are cutting, it is most often off of a failed thrust. So I can still stand in a guard like this, and I can thrust my sword forward, and if I thrust and I moved out of the way, then I can easily transition into a cut from that position. So when we are learning how to cut, we need to first understand how to engage the whole body. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with passing steps. Even though passing steps are not that common in rapier, it's easier to learn how to cut this way. So we'll start with our non-dominant leg forward, and we'll start with our sword over our head like this, over our head. If you're a side sword guy, you'll recognize this as guardia d'alta. You're going to cut straight down like this as you pass forward, and you allow it to cast all the way to the ground like this. And then from this position, all the way back up, and then all the way back down, and then all the way back up, and all the way back down. And then we'll start with our dominant leg forward, and we'll do the same thing, but with our sword on the other side. And we'll cut all the way down, and all the way up, and all the way down, and all the way up. You'll notice, as I cut, I make sure my tip is accelerating forward before I step. If I was fencing somebody, and I was in this guard, and I stepped, and then I cut, they have all that time in the world to hit me before then. So I must engage my sword first before my body so that I'm not exposing myself to some attack on preparation. Earlier I talked about the 3 different kinds of cuts. I have wrist cuts, elbow cuts, and shoulder cuts. We're going to start from the biggest and work our way down. So from my regular fencing stance like this, if I start with a shoulder cut, I'll pull my hand all the way back, I'll turn my hips to coil my hips forward, and I'll throw a cut from my shoulder with the power of my hips like this. Notice I pull my shoulder, turn my hips, and cut. And for side sword people, this should be very natural. This should be the same as if you're in guardia di fascia or you're in this high guard whose name escapes me at the moment. It should be the same as cutting all the way across like this. For elbow cuts, they'll be very similar, except they'll be done from the elbow, like this. And you won't have to engage much of your shoulder. The same thing will happen. I'll come up with my hips and still be able to cut through with my elbow, like this. If I wanted to go from the other side, like this, with my elbow, still engaging my hips, still coiling them backwards, and not just using the power of my arm to power this cut. And finally, we have our wrist cuts, which from the wrist, like this, or like this. Notice these cuts are much quicker because they follow a smaller arc. The larger muscle group that you use to power up your cut, obviously the more force you'll have behind said cut. Choosing which cut to do in the moment has a lot to do with the distance or the situation that you're moving through. If something happens and my sword is all the way behind my head, then there's no reason to throw a wrist cut because my arm's behind my head and I must use my shoulder to come around my body to cut in this way. If I'm very close to somebody and they're standing right here in front of me, I can no longer get my shoulder around and I must use my wrist to come around closely and hit them into the other opening. Some things to look out for when you begin to cut. If you begin to cut with the wrong muscle groups or you begin to compensate with some parts of your arm, it is possible that you'll notice yourself start to do this and your sword tip will drift down in front of you and you'll break that wrist that we talked about in previous videos. You want to make sure that your grip is in the right spot and your muscle groups are engaging in the right order so that when you cut, you just return the guard as though you're ready to fence again. So if I'm on my guard and I turn up to my cut, and I just return straight back to my guard. And notice my tip is still on line. There's no waggle in my tip as I throw, and it's very steady, very static like this. We don't want this, and we don't want to overswing and get out of the way. If we're making full cuts, cutting across is absolutely fine, but if your intention is to cut to the middle, then your tip dragging below your center line in this way is a mistake. You want to alleviate that as much as you can. Finally, as fencing is a mobile sport, very rarely, or perhaps never, should we ever be standing completely still and exchanging parry or post sequences with cuts and parries in this way. Fencing, oftentimes, especially rapier, you often lunge. You also passing lunge, and you can flesh, and all sorts of other different fancy footworks that we'll cover in a later video. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to talk very specifically about cutting into the lunge. So while we're on our regular fencing stance like this, what we're going to do is we're going to extend our arm forward like this as though we're lunging, like this, and we're going to extend and cut into the lunge instead. Extend, drop your point, and cut. Extend, drop, cut, like this. From the other side as well, like this. This action, as we cut through, is referred to as a moulinet, or a moulinello, or a stramazzone, depending on what style of Italian fencing that you do. In English, it's a wheel cut, because it makes a wheel. Very simple.